The wind off the plains came with no warning, a steady howl that rattled window panes and drove needles of dust under every cracked door in Brookvale. Elias Bran was already outside, sleeves rolled, shovel tilted into turf as though he were cutting loaves of bread from the earth itself. The winter hadn't yet arrived, but he could smell it in the iron-grey air, and the way crows flew low told him all he needed. He had maybe 3 weeks before the ground froze solid. Maybe less. The neighbours had come to watch, because that's what people do when they think someone's losing their mind. By mid-afternoon, 3 men from the next lots leaned on their rail fences, smirks deep as furrows. "Building castles out of sod now, Bran?" called Silas Jude, the blacksmith, flicking ash onto his glove. "What's next? Bathing in the mud?" Laughter crackled across the wind like dry corn husks. Elias didn't look up. He planted the shovel, stepped on its edge, and flipped another block of sod, 2 feet long, thick with roots and springy soil. He placed it along the slowly curving ridge he had staked. Behind him, the shape of a low wall began to take form, no taller than his knees, running along the inner edge of the yard. Not a real fence, not a proper structure, just earth, layered patiently, block on block. His wife, Mara, leaned at the door, her shawl tight. "They're saying you've gone to digging graves before the Lord calls," she murmured later that evening. Elias removed his boots without answering. The smell of kerosene filled the cabin. The lamplight showed the dirt caked to his hands. "Call them what they will. Graves hold cold still," he said. "These'll hold wind." At dawn, he worked again. The frost gleamed on every tuft where his shovel cut. He measured angles with a simple compass, driving stakes where the prevailing northwest gusts had the most bite. Between the stakes, he stretched thin hemp twine, not for strength, but alignment. The berms would curve, not stand straight. That he'd learned from watching snowdrifts years ago on the Dakota Trail. Straight fences collected drifts. Curved banks diverted them. By the 3rd day, the little yard looked odd even to him. From above, it might have resembled the lip of a bowl, low earthen mounds embracing the cabin like some primitive fort. A wagon passed on the road. The driver slowed, spat, and muttered something about burying himself early. The taunting rolled off Elias like sleet off canvas, but still, somewhere inside, it stung. Not because they mocked him, but because he knew how much easier it was to laugh than to learn. He'd been that way once too, before the winter of '83 took his brother's family in a snow-buried shack, where the smoke of their own fire couldn't escape. Each evening, as dusk bled into indigo, he checked the height of the berms and the spacing between them. 12 feet from the cabin walls at the narrowest point, enough to catch drifting snow without burying the structure itself. He fashioned small louvered windshields from spare planks, angling them so the fierce gusts would shear upward over the sod instead of clawing straight through. One curious boy came by, boots too big for his feet, and asked what all this dirt work was for. Elias smiled faintly. "You ever seen how a creek curves when the water's strong?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Then you know how to make wind flow. I'm just teaching it where to go." That night, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the first hard chill. Inside, the stove glowed cherry red. Outside, the wind ran its tests. Elias listened to the whistle shift and fade around his earthen walls, not slamming the house the way it used to. He slept a little easier, though laughter from earlier in the day still echoed faintly in his memory. He murmured to Mara before sleep claimed him, "They'll understand soon enough. When the white comes." By the next morning, the wind had shifted 3 points north and carried the smell of snow, though the sky stayed stubbornly clear. Elias took that as a gift. Cold air without moisture meant the ground would firm up, giving his sod blocks cleaner edges, and the berms would stack tighter without slumping. He started at the corners of the yard, where most men made fences square out of habit. Elias refused the habit. He drove a stake, then another, laying out a shallow arc like the rim of a spoon. Between them, he stretched twine again, not straight, but bowed, and he stepped back until the curve looked wrong in the way that meant it was right. Silas Jude wandered over, hammer belt still on, breath puffing white. "You've got yourself a moat," he said. "Only trouble is, moats are supposed to keep folk out." "It's not for folk," Elias replied, cutting another block. The shovel blade slid under the sod with a wet, tearing sound. Roots snapped like twine. "It's for what comes low and fast." Silas snorted. "Wind? You aiming to scare it off?" Elias paused long enough to point with the shovel toward the open prairie. "Wind doesn't get scared. It gets guided, same as sparks in a forge. You put a hood over it. You don't stop the fire. You stop the draft from throwing embers into your beard." Silas's eyes narrowed, as if he'd been challenged on his own trade. "Wind ain't fire." "No," Elias said, stacking the block, pressing it down with his boot heel. "But it obeys the same kind of rules. It takes the easiest path. Make the easy path go somewhere else." Silas shook his head and walked away, laughing to himself. But his laughter had lost a sliver of certainty. A man who'd spent years with bellows and chimneys could hear logic even when he didn't want to admit it. When the sun climbed higher, Elias called young Peter, Mrs. Calder's boy, the curious one, to help him set the windshields. They weren't tall, just plank panels lashed to stakes, rising perhaps 24 inches above the berm crest. Elias had scavenged the boards from a collapsed barn downriver. Their grain cracked but sound enough. He set them not as a solid wall, but as broken segments with hand-width gaps. Peter squinted. "Ain't that letting wind through?" "Some," Elias said. He handed the boy a strip of cloth. "Tie that to the stake." Peter did, and the cloth snapped and streamed. Elias moved the shield a few inches, then angled it. The cloth changed, less violent, more steady, as if the gust had been combed. "If you make a wall too tight, wind piles up and spills over hard," Elias explained. "It'll dig at the base, or jump the wall and dump snow right where you don't want it. But if you let it breathe, it slows without turning mean." He talked as he worked, because talking fixed the idea in his own head, and because winter punished the man who couldn't explain his choices, even to himself. Every shield went in at an angle, like a row of shoulders turned against a shove. The berm beneath them stayed low, thick, and wide, 3 sod blocks across at the base, then stepping inward as it rose. He tamped soil into the joints, not too wet, not too dry, and he laced the seams with straw so the blocks would knit together when the next rain came. Mara brought him a tin cup of coffee that tasted faintly of chicory and smoke. She stood beside him, eyes following the curve of the earthwork. "It does look like you're penning us in," she said quietly. Elias took a sip, then nodded toward the road. "Watch that dust," he said. A gust came, strong enough to make Mara's skirt snap. Dust lifted from the hard-packed street and skittered into their yard, then slowed as it hit the berm line. The swirling grit rose, rolled along the curve, and slid away toward the far side like water hitting a bank. The yard itself stayed calmer, the air inside it less sharp. Elias didn't smile, but his shoulders loosened. Mara's brows lifted. "It's quieter. That's the point." Elias set the cup down and tapped the berm with his knuckles. "Quiet air is warm air. Quiet air keeps snow where you choose." Later that day, he measured the distance from berm to cabin again, pacing it with long steps. The space mattered. Too close, and drifting snow would press against the walls and choke windows. Too far, and wind would have room to rebuild its speed before it reached the house. He settled on a ring that varied between 10-10 and 14-14 feet, wider on the northwest side where the worst gusts arrived, tighter on the southeast where the wind usually weakened. At dusk, he dug a shallow trench just inside the berm, only as deep as his hand, then lined it with small stones. Peter watched, puzzled. "That's for meltwater," Elias said. "Snow is patient. It waits all winter. Then one warm day it turns into a thief and steals your foundation." Peter's face wrinkled. "How's water steal?" "It finds any crack," Elias said. "Gets under a sill, freezes again, and pries wood apart like a wedge. So we give it a path to leave." He didn't mention the other reason. A wet yard in spring became a sickness pit, breeding rot and fever. Better to plan now than regret when the ground turned to mud. On the fourth evening, the town's men gathered outside Grady's store, swapping news and chewing tobacco. Elias came to buy twine and nails. The conversation stopped long enough for someone to mutter, "Here comes the gopher man." Grady himself, a broad man with flour dust on his sleeves, leaned on the counter. "Heard you're building a dirt corral," he said, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man repeating a joke he didn't fully own. Elias counted coins onto the wood. "I'm building a wind corral," he replied. "Snow follows wind. If you pen the wind, you pen the snow." A few chuckles rose. Someone said, "Snow don't need penning." "We shovel." Elias looked at the speaker, Tom Rourke, who had a new sawmill and the confidence that came with it. "You shovel what you can reach," Elias said. "You can't shovel what you can't find." Tom's grin held, but his eyes flickered. Most men in Brookvale had already lost something to winter: a calf, a wagon, a night's sleep, listening to boards creak in the dark. They laughed because fear was expensive and laughter was cheap. Elias left with his supplies, stepping back into the open air where the wind bit his ears. The sky over the prairie had a faint milky edge, as if rubbed with chalk. Snow coming soon, he thought. Not today. But it was building, far out where the land met the clouds. He returned home and made one more adjustment. He marked a path from the door to the woodpile, with stakes wrapped in rags, each rag soaked in a little lamp oil, so it wouldn't freeze stiff and vanish in white glare. If a blizzard turned the world into a blank page, he wanted a line of punctuation he could still read. That night, as the stove ticked and settled, Mara asked, "Do you truly think it will matter? All this shaping the yard?" Elias lay awake, listening to the wind brush the cabin like a hand testing a lock. "If I'm wrong," he said, "we'll have an ugly yard and sore backs. And if you're right?" He pictured streets buried so deep that people crawled between roof lines like moles. He pictured doors sealed from the outside, windows pressed shut by snow packed hard as clay. He pictured someone inside, striking a match and watching the flames starve because there wasn't enough air. "If I'm right," Elias said softly, "we'll have time. And time is what winter steals first." The first test came sooner than Elias expected. 2 weeks after he'd set the last of his windshields, the prairie woke to an early blast straight out of the Canadian plains. The thermometer outside Grady's store read 6 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn and dropped steadily. Trees went rigid with rime. Even the crows cawed once and vanished, black flecks against a pewter sky. Elias stood at the door, pulling on his gloves. The breath from his mouth rose like smoke from a forge. He stepped into the yard to see if the ground had held. The berms waited, calm and solid. The sod had frozen into a patchwork of dark green and white crust, the seams stiff as stone. When the gusts came, they struck the outer wall and climbed, curling upward before breaking apart. Inside the ring, the air thinned but didn't batter. It flowed slow, like water behind a boulder. He felt it immediately, how different the yard was from the road. On the road, snow whirlpooled like flour thrown from a bucket. Inside his yard, it drifted lazily, spiraling into pockets he'd deliberately left between the shields, exactly where he'd wanted it to catch. Testing theory against reality was the only truth Elias trusted. He crouched at one of those pockets, watched flakes mound, and saw the crest form along the berm instead of near the door. Each minute, the pattern repeated, as if someone invisible was tracing his layout with precision. By midday, the sky turned white without texture. The whole town looked sandblasted. Men forced their way up the street bent double, coats flapping. Elias's small porch creaked, but the door stayed clear. He opened it once just to be sure. The step below was clean. Snow had banked 2 feet high, only 6 paces away, but stopped there, spilling sideways. He couldn't help a quiet laugh, something rare on his face. Mara peeked through the window. "You laughing at trouble again?" "No," he said, brushing flakes off his hat. "Just measuring it." The fire in the stove burned low but steady, without constant bursts of cold air sneaking under the walls. Heat clung longer. They used only half the usual wood that evening. The kettle hissed instead of roaring. Elias marked the difference silently, a craftsman's accounting. The next day, the storm passed as quickly as it had come. Townsfolk dug paths to their gates, shoulders humped against shovels, breath heaving. Reuben Mallory next door stood at his fence, leaning over to shout, "You got lucky, Bran. Wind must have gone around you somehow." Elias almost answered, but didn't. He looked instead at Reuben's door, buried to its lintel, where the drift had slammed straight on. His own doorway stood open to the air. Even the cabin's small windows were free of snow rim. Luck didn't lay sod, Elias thought. He left it unsaid. Peter sprinted through the gate later, scarf trailing like a banner, cheeks red. "It worked," he panted. "My ma says your wall's a magic trick. Said she wants one too, wants her ground thaws." Elias chuckled, tousling the boy's hair. "No magic," he told him. "Just patience and roots." That afternoon, when the sky cleared and the sunlight hit glass-hard drifts, he walked the perimeter to see exactly how his experiment had held. On the windward side, snow lay piled high against the sod, some ridges almost 4 feet above the yard floor. On the lee side, near the kitchen window, only a thin dusting shimmered. He pressed a gloved hand to the outer slope. The compacted snow felt dense, almost cemented. He knelt, struck the side gently with a spade. The blade bounced back. "Good," he murmured. "It seals itself." Silas Jude came trudging by with 2 rough-planked sleds, muttering about broken chimney flues. He stopped when he saw the mound protecting Elias's house. "Huh, looks like you grew yourself a snow fort." Elias leaned on his spade. "That's how you know it's working. The snow's supposed to find it, stick to it. Out there it bites. Here it settles." Silas squinted into the yard. "Wind sure calms down in there." "It's about slowing," Elias said. "Wind moves fast enough. It carries knives. Slow it down, it puts 'em away." For a moment, Silas had no retort. He merely sniffed, adjusted the sled rope in his mitts, and said, "Maybe you can teach me that trick come spring." He trudged on. That night, Mara found Elias standing outside again with a lantern, testing how the light bent through the drifts. Frost spirals glowed faintly where air pooled. "You going to stare at snow all night?" she called softly. "Maybe," Elias said. "You can learn more from one drift than a whole month of talk." He noted one flaw, a narrow eddy near the east corner where snow had begun to sneak inward. It wasn't dangerous yet, but he marked it with a stick. In spring, he'd adjust that curvature and add another angled shield. Small correctives were the difference between a novelty and a method. By morning, the noise around town had shifted. People spoke his name differently now, not with laughter, but with curiosity they covered up as insult. At the general store, Reuben was recounting how his door got sealed shut, and how his wife had nearly lit the kitchen table on fire to keep warm. Someone joked that Bran's hobbit walls might be useful after all. Another said, "Maybe so, but I'd be damned before I bury my yard like a mole." Elias kept his eyes on the sack of flour he was weighing. He didn't argue. The winter wasn't yet half done, and he'd learned long ago that mockery was just the first stage of understanding. That night, when another northern squall slid across the plains, he sat by the stove with Mara as the wind hummed outside, soft, distant, as though muffled by hands of earth. The cabin walls did not tremble. Ash gusted briefly in the chimney, then steadied. Between the sound of logs crackling and the quiet percussion of blown snow skittering along the shields, Elias could almost feel the difference in pressure, the invisible balance between storm and stillness. He said quietly, "It's working better than I guessed." Mara poured tea, steam curling gold in lamplight. "Then maybe," she said, "you ought to write it down." "I will," Elias replied, thinking of the maps rolled under his workbench. "But first, I'll wait for the next storm. The first run only tells you if you guessed right. The second one proves if the guess can stand." He looked through the window. The berms shone faintly in starlight, their outlines blurred beneath a crystalline frost. Beyond them, the prairie lay raw and endless, waiting for the true blizzard that would decide everything. Sunday brought the church bell muted under a low sky. Brookvale gathered in its narrow steepled chapel, coats dripping meltwater, stove glowing red at the front. The air smelled of wax and damp wool. Elias stood in the last pew as Reverend Crane preached about humility, about those who raise their walls too high to hear God's breath. The phrasing drew murmured chuckles that weren't aimed at heaven. Silas Jude coughed into his fist, glancing back with an amused tilt. Elias met his eyes and said nothing. A man didn't need to fight every rumor. Some battles froze their own soldiers. After the service, the congregation filtered out into a brittle wind. Mara waited near the door, shawl clutched at her throat. "They mean nothing by it," she said. "They mean exactly by it," Elias replied quietly. "Only time will teach them differently." Outside, snowflakes began to fall again, the small dry kind that roll in eddies over hard ground. He noted their drift, how they flitted along barn siding, then caught at every fence post. Each obstacle threw a tail of white behind it. Even as he spoke to people, his mind measured air currents, direction, rebound, load. He couldn't stop himself. That obsession was both armor and burden. By late afternoon, he made his way to the store for provisions. The warmth inside carried smells of coffee, sawdust, and talk too loud for comfort. Tom Rourke was in full voice. Sooner or later, that dirt's going to thaw, sag, and crush his fence line. What'll he do then? Build another from potatoes? Laughter rolled like small thunder. Grady, wiping his hands on a flour sack, tried to hush them, but even he smiled. Elias placed his list on the counter. "Lamp oil, salt pork, rope," he said evenly. Tom leaned his elbows on a barrel. "You really think you've outsmarted the weather?" Elias counted out coins. "No," he said. "I only aim to outweight it." Tom smirked, but found no easy answer. The silence that followed was thin and dry, like the pause before a match flares. Elias left with his goods tucked under one arm. Behind him, talk restarted in lower tones. Something about a man who couldn't leave well enough alone. He'd been called worse, though the words grazed him all the same. Back home, he set about small tasks that steadied the mind, mending harness straps, greasing hinges, scraping soot from the stovepipe with a bent strip of tin. The routine work made thought flow smoother, a steady drip instead of a flood. That evening, Mara asked if he'd ever tire of being the odd one out. He smiled gently. "Only when I forget why I'm right." At dusk, the temperature dipped below zero. He went outside to split wood. Each axe stroke rang like frozen glass. When he paused to breathe, the air cut his lungs raw. Above him, the moon rose pale orange behind fast clouds. A hunter's moon, often the sign of heavier snow to come. For the first time, Elias felt the old anxiety flicker. Had he prepared enough? The berms stood, true and solid, but nature allowed no guarantees. He walked their length by lamplight, trailing gloved fingers across the ridges, where snow had already fused into compact crust. He kicked at one section. It held firm. At another, the top had softened slightly, wind carving a shallow groove. He made a note to pour water there tomorrow, so it could freeze smooth again. In the stillness, he heard the faint crack of ice on distant branches, a brittle, unsettling sound, like bones adjusting. Then, faintly, voices, laughter from the direction of Grady's store. It carried easily through open air. He turned toward it, jaw tight for a moment, then exhaled a cloud of steam that drifted upward and vanished. The next morning, the weather eased, but the air pressure felt wrong. The barometer needle he kept above the stove dropped 2 marks since dawn. Old habit made him read the sky carefully. The horizon wore a thin, low blur that wasn't cloud yet, but promised storm. Still, at midday, he went into town for the Farmers' Council, where they discussed road clearing and hay reserves. Inside the meeting hall, every bench creaked, and every man half watched him when he entered. Councilman Dreves, a round man with dandruff on his shoulders, gestured with his pipe. "We appreciate your attendance, Elias," he said in that tone smooth as sleet. "Some neighbors are concerned that your earthworks may collapse into the drainage ditch come thaw." Elias folded his cap slowly, laid it across his knees. "They won't. There's a stone channel under the sod. Melt will run west." "Still," Dreves pressed, "we're a community. Shared runoff, shared safety. A yard wall that blocks sight lines may complicate rescue if heavy snow comes." The irony nearly made Elias laugh aloud, being accused of blocking rescues by the same men who built ornamental gates that froze shut each winter. Instead he said, "When heavy snow comes, sight lines will be the least of our worries. Being able to breathe inside our homes will be the first." A soft rumble of unease filled the room. Few liked hearing talk of suffocation. Too many dead that way in past winters. But none dared contradict him directly. Instead, Dreves nodded, pretending conclusion. "Very well, then. Let's hope your theory holds, Mr. Bran." Outside, wind lifted again, stronger now. Elias felt it tug his coat, as though the air itself were impatient. Mara met him halfway home, cheeks pink with cold. "Was it bad?" "As expected," he said. "They'll forgive me when they forget the laughter that came before." That night, he woke to a sound like sand poured on a drum, sleet hitting the roof. He rose, lit a lantern, and checked each window for drafts. The berms beyond gleamed under lamplight, curving smooth, protective, alien. He pressed his hand to the glass. It vibrated faintly, breath of the storm's edge. He counted seconds between gusts. Sometimes that told him more than instruments could. 20 heartbeats apart, then 15, then 10. Pressure building. In his notebook he jotted, "Barometer fell, north wind sharpening, birds gone silent by dusk." He closed it carefully. Outside, the world whispered in warning. Within hours, the real blizzard would form, and Brookvale's laughter would fade like sparks buried under snow. All through the night, icy sleet peppered the roof until dawn came pale and uncertain. The whole sky looked bruised, yellow-grey, swollen with cold light that seemed to hurt just to look at. Elias felt it before he stepped outside, the raw stillness that came before great storms, when even your breath seemed too loud. He pushed through the door and tested the air. It smelled of salt and iron. The wind had died completely. That was the true warning. The land felt like a lung drawn in and held tight. At the far end of Main Street, men shouted over wagons half frozen into ruts. The thaw from yesterday had turned to glaze overnight, sealing wheels into the streets. Horses slipped, snorted, eyes rolling white. Elias scanned every roofline. Icicles hung long and crooked, draining meltwater down the boards. Back in his yard, the berm edges had trapped that runoff perfectly. Little channels led melt toward the gravel path, just as he'd shaped them. But now, a more serious thought burned in him. Snow he could handle. Ice suffocated. It sealed vents, froze latches, welded shutters shut. He knelt by the kitchen side, fingers tracing the lip of the air vent he'd built last August. It was clear for now. Still, he pulled a scrap of tin and reshaped its mouth, cutting a small hood to guide any sleet downward instead of in. The real fight's not the cold, he muttered to himself. It's the stillness afterward. Mara joined him, blanket around her shoulders. You've been pacing since before sunrise. There's something brewing heavy out there, he said, glancing southwest. If the wind dies this long, it'll swing back hard. Will your walls hold? She asked. They'll hold fine, he answered, though the certainty wasn't full. It's the others I'm not sure about. By afternoon, the freeze deepened. Even the pump handle groaned like a hinge in pain. Elias melted ice in a pail for drinking water, then carried wood until sweat ran down his back. Every muscle in his body hummed from worry, the kind that made you work twice as long to quiet your own pulse. At dusk, the barometer needle plunged so low, it trembled over the notch. Never seen it fall that fast, Mara whispered when he showed her. He nodded grimly. That means the front's tightened. It'll hit tonight. Elias used the remaining daylight to carve shallow gutters through the snow between the berms, like river deltas. He hammered thin rods beside each path and tied oiled cloth flags to them, navigational points if visibility vanished. The flags slapped once, weakly, then hung limp. Not an ounce of wind yet. By supper, he forced himself to eat. Bread crust and beans warmed over coals. The stove's faint hiss echoed like an insect. Mara sat opposite him, sewing with nervous fingers. What if, she began, then stopped. Whatever you're about to ask, Elias said. The answer is, we stay put. When darkness fell, the silence outside was absolute, and then, a dull pressure, deep as a held breath, shifted the boards. Elias froze. The first gust slammed into the cabin so fiercely the lamp flickered sideways. Another hit, harder, dropping a scatter of soot from the chimney. Then came the roar. It sounded like a dozen locomotives grinding through gravel, an unbroken, exploding howl that bent trees flat. Snow ripped sideways across the fields, turning the lantern light at the window into bright smoke. Mara gripped the table edge. God Almighty! Stay low, Elias shouted. He yanked down the lamp flame, grabbed the poker, and bolted to the door. The yard beyond seethed, white and blind. The berms vanished entirely within seconds, outlines smudged beneath flying snow. He cracked the door open no more than an inch. The low walls beyond disrupted the gale just enough that the porch remained mostly clear, though loose powder whirled like mist. Still breathing, he muttered, squinting into it. It's doing its job. Each blast raked the earthen shields and tore upward. He could hear the difference. Over the yard, the roar turned hollow, split into eddies rather than direct impacts. But that resilience came with a new risk, the sheer volume of drifting snow collecting along the berm tops. He slammed the door, barred it, and paced. The cabin groaned as pressure dropped again. The oil lamp struggled to keep its flame even. Sometimes it guttered sideways, hungry for oxygen. Elias's mind leapt to the vent again. He shoved open the back hatch and crawled halfway out into flying crystal dust. The hood held. Air still moved. Most homes in town never had such exits. He imagined neighbors wedged inside behind snow layers, feet thick, breathing the same stale air until fires choked their oxygen away. When he came back in, Mara wiped frost from his beard. "We should pray," she whispered. "We should," Elias said, tightening the stove damper, "but we should also listen." By midnight the storm had reached a pitch too high for thought. Wooden beams hummed. Snow slapped like canvas under a lash. Every hour, Elias checked gaps around the stovepipe, hammering wadding into any that whined. His hands bled small cuts from frozen nails. Peering through the cabin slit window, he saw nothing but diffused light, no true dark or day, only reflection from endless snow whipping beneath a hidden moon. He lost sense of time. Then a heavy thud, not wind this time, but a body, hit the outer door. Mara gasped. Another pound followed, muffled under shrieking gusts. Elias grabbed the latch. "Who's there?" A voice cracked through the gap. "Tom! Tom Rourke! For God's sake, let me in!" Elias hauled the door open a foot, catching one arm and dragging the man inside. Snow plastered Tom's beard. His eyebrows were encased in ice. "Your chimney," he coughed, "collapsed. Smoke. Inside. Couldn't breathe." Mara sank to her knees beside him. Elias jammed the door shut, threw a quilt around Tom's shoulders, and looked out once more. Across the buried yard, faint sparks flickered near where Rourke's mill lay, the reflection of fire inside blocked walls. He felt an electric jolt of realization. This was only the beginning. The storm had turned the entire town into a maze of tombs, and Brookvale's laughter, once sharp as mockery, would freeze silent before dawn. By morning, the wind had carved Brookvale into something unrecognizable, no longer a town, but a buried labyrinth. Only the faint hum of the gale remained, a dull, steady moan beneath a deadened world. Where fences once stood, curving ridges of snow lined the streets like frozen surf. Elias leaned his shoulder against the door. It resisted for a long moment before giving with a hissing sigh. Outside, the air was bright and blue but deadly still. His porch roof had grown a beard of icicles nearly 3 feet long. He could see just the tops of wagons protruding from the white. The strange part was how his yard looked untouched compared to the rest. The berms now transformed into glistening dunes. They had done more than deflect the wind. They had caught and stabilized the drifts exactly where Elias had intended. The cabin itself stood inside a clear hollow, shaped like a bowl, sunlight reflecting faintly off the packed crust. Mara stepped onto the porch behind him. "It's quiet," she whispered. "Too quiet," he replied. "That's what comes after the real strike, the cold that never ends." Tom Rourke stirred from his blanket near the stove, pale but breathing steady. His eyes darted toward the window. "Did the mill burn?" Elias looked toward the ridge. Nothing showed but smooth white hills. "If it did, it's buried deep now," he said. Tom groaned, guilt written plain on his face. "My boy's with Mallory's, half-mile east. I ran before—" Elias cut him off gently. "You ran because you could still move. That's reason enough." He took stock fast. Rations would last a week if measured carefully. Woodpile still halfway full. Air ducts clean. He'd built margin but not luxury. The rest would depend on how long the town stayed sealed. By noon, small eddies of loose snow swirled again, wind returning. Elias understood what that meant. The blizzard proper wasn't over. The second front was sweeping back. The lull had lasted only a few hours. He had a narrow window to turn preparation into survival. He strode to the north berm with his shovel, eyes narrowed against the glare. The snow there had built a perfect ridge 5 feet high. He jabbed the shovel into it. The packed crust rang like a drum, perfect for reinforcement. He carved a trench along the inner side to keep an open path, shaping the snow into hard edges so it would refreeze faster. The principle was simple. Smooth surfaces shed new snow. Rough ones gather it. Mara watched from the doorway. "You're digging now?" she called over the gusts. "It's not digging," he said. "It's tuning." He threw a glance toward the neighbor's direction. There were no rooftops visible, only subtle hummocks in the vast plain. A dark dread bit into him. He'd have to reach them if the storm kept people trapped. He fastened a loop of rope across his shoulder, tied 5 stakes to it, and filled a canvas pouch with matches, a tin of lard, and 2 sandwiches. "If the wind rises again, wait an hour," he told Mara. "If I'm not back then, stay sealed." Tom lifted his head weakly. "You going out there? Are you mad?" "Maybe," Elias said, pulling his scarf tight. "But if anyone's alive in those drifts, they'll have minutes, not hours." He set a line from the door to the nearest berm crest, a lifeline of plaited rope tied around a beam inside the cabin. His boots sank ankle-deep only at first, but by the time he reached the ridge's outer lip, the snow rose to his thighs. He hauled himself over the crest and descended into the blinding open, following faint shadows of wagons. At the second house, he found the chimney barely visible, smoke struggling through pinholes of ice. He slammed the shovel butt against the drift, listening. A muffled shout answered. He worked fast, digging a breathing shaft. Warm air puffed out, carrying soot. A woman's hand appeared, clawing at the opening. "Don't climb out," Elias warned. "Stay inside. Open this hole wide from your side. Keep the path to it clear. Don't burn too hard, or you'll eat your air." She shouted thanks that whipped away on the wind. He moved on toward the Mallory homestead. The rope tugged at his waist like a leash to sanity, each step further from home blinding him with white glare. His hands began to ache from cold despite wool. When the silhouette of their roof hump emerged, it looked more like the lid of a buried chest. "Anyone alive?" he bellowed, slamming metal against crust. Nothing. He hit again. The third time, faint tapping echoed beneath him. He dug until his arms screamed. At 2 feet down, the spade struck hard wood, the eaves. He cleared another foot, then saw a line of darker shadow, window glass. He punched it gently with the handle's tip. The pane cracked inward. A rush of grey air and coughing followed. Then a voice, a child's cry. He pulled back just far enough to force words through the slit. "Dig from the inside. Keep the path narrow. Cold keeps you breathing." He couldn't spare more help. His fingers were numb, and the rope jerked under the swirling wind. Time dragged each second longer. When he finally made it back over his berm, vision swimming from exhaust and frozen lashes, the cabin door was half covered, but still visible thanks to its cloth markers fluttering weakly. Mara grabbed him the moment he stumbled through. "You're frozen solid." He laughed through cracked lips. "Still breathing, though. So's Mallory's lot. They'll live." Tom stared, wordless, at Elias as steam rose from his coat. Outside, the wind's low thrum built again. Snow hissed across the berm tops. Soon the world would vanish in white once more. Elias sat by the stove, flexing blue fingers back to life, and murmured, "They mocked it once, because it looked like a graveyard wall. Maybe that's the trick of it. To live, you build what looks like dying first." Mara didn't answer. She only fed one more log into the stove and whispered a prayer neither of them quite remembered learning. Outside, the wind began to howl again, this time from the northwest, carrying ice pellets sharp enough to score wood. The blizzard's second breath had arrived, and as the first snow plumes rose over Brookvale's drowned streets, Elias braced himself to prove, one last time, whether his earthen geometry could truly outmatch nature's chaos. By nightfall, the world had dissolved into motion. The second wave hit harder than the first, not just snow this time, but crystals of sleet that hissed like sand poured through steel funnels. The wind screamed over Brookvale, shredding loose shutters and stripping bark from frozen trees. Inside the Brand's cabin, the storm's voice pressed against walls like a living thing. Every minute, Elias checked his rope line to ensure it stayed taut against the doorframe, marking the only safe path beyond the threshold. Each time he cracked the door, air rushed in with the force of wave surf. This was no ordinary blizzard. It was an eraser scrawling out the town. "Don't open it again," Mara pleaded over the roar. "You'll let the heat die." "I need to watch how it moves," Elias said, fastening his coat again. "If the yard starts filling instead of venting, we'll suffocate before we freeze." Tom sat on the floor near the stove. head bandaged, eyes wide and glassy. "You're saying that could happen?" Elias turned to him. "It happens every winter somewhere. The wind stacks wrong. You get sealed in. Minutes sometimes, before the fire eats the air." That stole the room's breath for a moment. Even the storm outside seemed to hesitate. Elias waited until the next low gust rattled the chimney, then stepped out into the maelstrom, rope pulling tight against his waist. The world immediately vanished. All direction dissolved. The only light came from the lamp he carried cupped in gloved hands. The glow barely touched the snow before being swallowed whole. He could feel, not see, where the berms stood. The air changed texture there, a subtle calm at shin height, a space where the weight of wind broke. He crouched to check the venting pockets, the places he'd designed to catch snow deliberately. Each one was full but stable, sloping backward instead of spilling inward. The yard's hollows remained open. He wiped ice from his beard and muttered, half to the wind itself, "Hold together. You're shaped right. Don't give up now." A muffled sound broke through, metal bending, then snapping. He turned. A wagon tongue had torn free somewhere nearby and was tumbling in the storm. It slammed against one of the berms and buried itself halfway into the snow. For a heartbeat, the interruption caused a vortex that blew straight toward the porch, funneling loose snow like smoke through a keyhole. Elias cursed, lunged forward, and shouldered the piece out of position. He rammed it deeper on the windward side, converting its shape into part of the outer barrier and tossing handfuls of snow over it to smooth airflow. Improvisation became survival. He made it back to the door panting, ice clattering from his stiff coat. Inside, he collapsed against the wall, while Mara thrust a hot mug of water into his shaking hands. "The berms are loaded but steady," he rasped. "If they hold 2 more hours, the drifts will seal outer gaps themselves." Above the stovepipe, faint groans rattled the rafters. Outside, wind struck in heavy pulses, rhythmic, like the breathing of some huge animal. Each pulse reduced visibility to 0. Even the lamp glass filmed opaque. Time bled. They took turns stoking the stove, guarding it like a watchtower flame. Every hour, Elias marked notes in his book: temperature drop, sound pitch, rate of whistling under the eaves. Observation kept fear tame. Then, near dawn, the storm reached its absolute pitch, an unbroken wail that made the boards hum underfoot. The floor thrummed through their boots. The windows bowed inward visibly, frost fractals spreading like veins. Elias crouched beside them, eyes narrow. "If one of those gives," he said, "get to the inside wall and lie flat." But the glass held. The sod banks outside had turned into sculpted ice, wind-polished to armor. Somewhere beyond, faint hammering reached his ears. He stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Mara frowned. "I thought it was the wind." "No, that's someone striking." Without hesitation, Elias threw on his coat again. "Elias, don't—" He didn't answer. He took a new coil of rope, tied it to the beam, and opened the door into steam-white chaos. The rope line led him toward the neighboring house, once Reuben Mallory's. He followed it mostly by feel, tug by tug, each step a guess. The hammering grew louder, desperate. When his mitten brushed solid wood, he realized he'd found their roof, not their door, the entire structure buried to its chimney. He clawed upward, shoveling handfuls into the gale until the striking came clearer. "Reuben, where's your vent?" Through the wind came faint words. "Smoke, no breath." He jammed the shovel handle into the snow, twisting furrows to create a vertical shaft. After several frantic minutes, a geyser of warm grey vapor burst through, followed by coughing. He shouted back, "Keep it open from your side. You've got air now." He wanted to do more, but his skin already burned from cold. He staggered home, leaning on the rope until the yellow glow of the cabin broke the blur. Inside, the door slammed behind him. Snow fell off him in clumps like plaster. Mara threw a blanket around his shoulders. "They're alive," he said between chattering teeth. "They'll last the night." Tom looked dazed. "You saved them?" Elias shook his head. "They saved themselves. I just reminded the air where to go." When dawn finally came, the storm began to tire. The wind slackened from howl to groan to sigh. Silence returned 1 fragile inch at a time, until even their own breathing sounded too loud. Elias pushed open the door one last time. Light blazed off the white amphitheatre of his yard. Every fence, barn, and road was gone under 15 feet of compacted snow, except his cabin, sitting inside a hollow perfectly outlined by berms now fused into ice. The walls had trapped snow where it belonged and redirected the rest skyward. The town around him lay in tunnels and pits, roofs poking through like shipwreck masts. For a long moment, Elias simply stared, chest heavy. Survival always carried the strange guilt of having guessed right when others had not. Behind him, Mara whispered, "They'll see it now." "Maybe," he murmured. "Once they can dig enough to look." And somewhere beyond the silence, an echo of a shovel bit into snow, the first sound of others, alive, trying to reach daylight. By mid-morning, the sun hung thin and colourless over the wreck of Brookvale. Elias stood on what used to be his porch roof, now level with the packed snow of his yard. The air glinted silver-white, frozen crystals suspended like dust. Each breath burned his lungs. He'd tied a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed, and scanned the shapes that had replaced streets, soft humps, steep ridges, narrow troughs where chimneys barely broke the surface. A mile away, the prairie looked like the sea after a storm, smoother, calmer, but hiding death beneath its surface. Yet here within his yard there was space, real air, swaths of blue sky above. The berms stood shining, their inner slopes hard as glass. Beneath them, he'd carved narrow walkways that stayed sheltered from the savage glare. He tested one path, sliding down knee-deep, until he reached the first drift pocket he had formed deliberately weeks ago. The snow there was compact, but breathable, fine enough to shovel aside in layers. Behind him, Mara called from the doorway, "You'll exhaust yourself before noon if you start that." "I'll exhaust myself later," he said. "Right now, I need to know if anyone's reachable from here." He tied a sled rope around his waist and pushed forward into the passage he'd known would form between the western berm and the old barn remains. It was eerie silence, broken only by wind sighs through vents. Underfoot, snow squeaked, dry, crystalline, too cold to pack. It reflected light upward into every shadow, so the tunnel gleamed pale blue. When he reached the boundary where his yard ended, he stopped. Just beyond lay the open street, or what used to be one. Now it was a canyon nearly 20 feet deep, walled with sintered snow like alabaster. Elias whistled low. "Streets into tunnels," he said. "Never seen it this bad." As if on cue, a cry echoed faintly along the trench, hoarse but unmistakable. "Help! Anyone there?" Elias knelt, eyes searching the glare until he spotted a waving glove 3 houses down the trench. He shouted, "Hold on, I'm coming!" and dug with practiced rhythm, sliding through the channel that led out from his berm's base. One slope at a time, he descended into the drift. His coat scraped, snow crumbling down around him. When he pulled up beside the source of the voice, he found Mrs. Calder and her 2 children wedged in a small cavity dug against a window. They were alive but trembling, faces grey, frost blooming in their hair. "How long?" Elias asked. "Since last night," she rasped. "Fire died. Couldn't get wood. We tried to dig out the window, but it just kept caving." He scanned the snow above them. The layers told a story. Wind-packed strata tight as boards, clear as bottle glass. One wrong move could collapse the roof of their narrow pocket. He beckoned toward his own yard. "You see that curve there? That's open ground. I can drag you 3 one at a time through a crawl path. You watch the rope and keep behind me." They nodded, too cold for argument. He worked his spade sideways, cutting with the grain of the drift instead of against it, a trick learned from snow cutting on mountain passes years before. The tunnel widened enough for crawling, each coil of rope feeding back toward the brighter hollow that led home. When Mrs. Calder's youngest began to whimper, Elias handed her his scarf. "Wrap this. Keep breath slow. You'll make it." They reached the inner yard, 60 shivering minutes later. Mara met them at the opening, eyes wide. She helped haul them inside, where Tom fetched blankets and jars of rendered lard to warm their hands. Elias stayed outside, listening. Between wind gusts, he could hear more faint cries, spread across the white expanse, each one swallowed, then returned as an echo that made it impossible to tell direction. Brookvale sounded haunted. He cupped his hands and shouted, "If you can hear me, stay where you are. Make noise every few minutes. We'll find you." He returned inside for bread and a swig of whiskey before heading out again. Mara grabbed his arm. "You've done enough." "Not yet," he said. "The next few hours will harden this snow to shell. If I don't cut vents now, no one will breathe till thaw." The second rescue took him north towards Silas Jude's blacksmith shop. The place looked erased, only its forged chimney showing. He dug to it and found the exhaust completely sealed. His fist broke through, releasing a column of grey steam and sputter of sparks. A voice cried from below, Silas himself, hoarse but alive. "Well," Silas croaked, when Elias cleared the hole wide enough to see daylight. "Guess your dirt walls weren't so foolish after all." "Guess not," Elias muttered, digging faster. "Next time, listen when someone explains wind." He jammed a length of pipe at an angle into the vent, forming a more permanent airway, then drove home again, half frozen and light-headed. By sunset, his berms looked like islands surrounded by smooth white sea. Trails connected a dozen tiny holes where life whispered through snow tunnels. Smoke drifted faintly from some of them. The sky was pure cold fire, pink at the edges, blue overhead, and the whole world glittered as though made of crushed diamonds. Mara stood beside him. "They're alive because of your yard. They're alive because dirt didn't laugh," he said. His voice cracked. Exhaustion or emotion, he didn't know. "Funny thing, Mara. All my life they said the ground was dead. But today, it breathed for us." She smiled, pressing his hand. "Come in. Warm first. The rest you can teach them later." But Elias lingered one moment longer at the edge of the berm, watching smoke and faint movement across white plains. From mockery to life, the difference measured only in how a man shaped the wind and listened when it spoke. Tonight, for the first time all winter, Brookvale slept, not peacefully, but still breathing. Morning rose clear, frigid, and eerily beautiful. The storm had passed, leaving the world sculpted and silent. The drifts were so dense they glistened like carved marble, not snow at all, but stone made of winter. Smoke rose thin and wavering from the small vents Elias had cut into Brookvale's white crust, each one proof of a life preserved. Elias strapped on his wooden snowshoes and stared down the pale canyons that replaced the town's roads. He could hear voices now, faint but real, echoing off the frozen walls. "Over here," someone called. "We've got a door clear." He waved, recognizing Silas Jude by his soot-dark hood, trudging alongside 2 others with shovels. Elias descended from his berm path, his boots crunching over crust that held like packed clay. The first man to greet him clasped his shoulder. "You the one that dug the Calders out?" Elias nodded once, scanning the street that was no longer a street, but a trench almost 12 feet deep. Roof lines poked through like wrecked ships at low tide. "We're all digging," he said. "Doesn't matter who strikes the first blow." Silas jabbed a thumb toward Elias's yard. "Your place stayed clear when every wall on Main got swallowed. The whole town's coming to have a look." Elias felt a mix of pride and unease. He had built it to survive, not to show off, but in this silence of ruin, his design stood out like a beacon. They worked the morning together, chipping vents, carving steps from one hollow to another. At each tunnel they found faces, pale, soot-streaked, half-starved but alive. The bran yard became a staging ground, a place where smoke cleared, where the wind was mild enough to breathe without a scarf. By noon, half the town had gathered there. Mara and Mrs. Calder brewed thin soup on the stove, while Elias rigged a line of poles with coloured rags to mark a path to each surviving home. The wind whispered through the sod ramparts softly now, as if reminding them it could as easily return. Old Councilman Dreaves came limping in on a whittled cane. His beard was white with frost, his coat torn. "Mr. Bran," he said, voice shaking less from cold than humility, "about what we said before, about the ditch-blocking runoff. Seems it blocked our graves instead." Elias met his eyes without triumph. "Ground didn't block you," he said. "It just showed mercy slower than we did." The man nodded, lips trembling with a gratitude he couldn't voice. As the day went on, townsfolk began asking questions in earnest. How high to make the walls, what curve to follow, whether sod or packed snow worked better. Elias answered quietly, sketching simple diagrams in the frost on his shovel's blade. Wind direction, deflection angles, vent placement. He showed Silas where he'd knotted cord between stakes to shape arcs, how each berm's crest sloped outward by a hand's width to turn the gale upward. "It's not about height," he explained. "It's about guidance. Give the wind a path it prefers, and it'll take it without argument." "Always thought you fought storms by standing square," Silas muttered. "You don't fight sky," Elias said. "You persuade it." The townspeople began carving shallow imitation ridges around their exposed roofs, instinctively copying his patterns. Within hours, the centre of Brookvale looked less like devastation and more like method, tunnels ordered by rumour of reason. When twilight came, Elias climbed to the top of his frozen berm. The sun fell low, turning the snowfield gold. Smoke trails curved lazily upward from every new vent hole. From here, the town looked almost alive again. He turned as footsteps crunched behind him. It was Tom Rourke, the mill owner, one arm bandaged, eyes hollowed by guilt and awe. "I came to say, I was wrong, Elias, about all of it, about dirt and walls and the fool building them. I owe you my life, and so do half these folks." Elias studied him for a moment, then offered a hand. "No one owes me. Just promise you'll build smart next time." Tom nodded, voice rough. "I will. You'll show us how." "I can draw the lines," Elias said. "The rest, the ground will teach you." They stood in silence for a while, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a new sound emerged, the slow thud of picks striking packed snow, rhythm steady, courageous. Survival had given birth to work again. As night approached, the temperature plummeted further, yet the air no longer felt cruel. The berms glowed faintly blue in starlight, their curves beautiful in a way Elias hadn't expected. Mara joined him at the crest and leaned into his side. "Never thought the thing that made them laugh would become their shelter," she said softly. "Most sense in this world arrives late," Elias answered. Below them, Brookvale flickered with oil lamps behind cleared windows, each household exhaling steam into the brittle air. The streets were still tunnels, but now they connected, living veins carved through the body of the storm's aftermath. "Tomorrow," Elias said, "we'll start digging outward together. Maybe next winter, no one will have to dig at all." And for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not the smile of vindication, but of a man who had finally heard silence as something kind. Spring came late that year, crawling over the prairie as though afraid to wake what winter had buried. For weeks, the snow retreated inch by inch, revealing fences shattered, roofs torn half away, and trees stripped clean to grey bones. Yet in the heart of Brookvale, a small island of green began to show first, Elias Brand's yard. The berms had softened into low mounds ribbed with last season's straw. Meltwater ran neatly through the drainage cuts he'd dug months ago, turning them into tiny rivulets that babbled past the cabin like content size. New grass pushed through the seams. Above, skylarks returned as if they'd simply misplaced the town and found it again. Elias stood with a spade in hand, recutting the outer curve for summer vegetables. His fingers still carried scars from that night, the blizzard's engraving of proof. From the road, voices carried. "Mr. Bran," someone called. He turned to see Silas Jude, Tom Rourke, and half a dozen neighbours approaching with freshly cut sod stacked in wagon beds. Their laughter was low and respectful now, the easy sound of people working towards something rather than mocking it. Tom grinned. "We're trying it your way before next snow. Figure we'd start now while ground's still soft." Elias set the spade in the dirt. "Not my way," he said. "The way that works." He walked them along the berm line, pointing where to lower a curve or leave openings for melting runoff. As they listened, the men nodded like students around a rare teacher. The same ground that had once sparked their contempt now held their attention as if it was scripture. Behind them, Mara and Mrs. Calder laid out bread and coffee on a rough plank table. Children ran barefoot over the thawing yard, their laughter carrying in the mild wind. The sound mixed with shovels striking earth, a rhythm better than any sermon. By noon, the new sod walls began rising on 3 plots nearby. Each one bore its maker's slight signature. Silas used stones at the base, for luck. Tom preferred taller scarped sides, to keep wind guessing. Elias didn't correct them. Innovation meant ownership. What mattered was that the principle spread. That week, more families joined. Within 10 days, nearly every home in Brookvale had its own low embankment tracing the edges of its yard. The village looked strange, alien, but no one cared anymore. The talk in Grady's store turned from ridicule to craft. Which curve caught less snow, which vent drew smoke best. Even Reverend Crane, who had once preached about walls that silenced God's breath, began blessing the earth shelters as testament to stewardship. One evening, the council met in the room above the store. Dreves presided, his beard now shorter, his pride too. He cleared his throat. "Gentlemen and ladies," he added awkwardly, "Brookvale owes its survival to one man's preparation and to a principle we ignored. I propose we adopt the Bran method officially. We'll include the diagrams in next season's town almanac." There was no applause, just quiet assent, which somehow meant more. Elias felt heat rise behind his eyes. He'd never wanted title or credit. Still, hearing the words, "the Bran method," stirred a strange softness in him. Afterward, he lingered outside in the cool dusk. The rebuilt yards curved like sleeping animals under the stars. Wind slipped through them gently, a whisper rather than a blow. Mara joined him, linking her arm through his. "Do you believe they'll keep to it?" she asked. "Once you've seen breathless folk dug from snow tunnels, you don't forget easily," he said. "And next winter, when the first storm hits and the doors stay open, that'll remind them sharper than words ever could." A horse snorted nearby. Silas's forge bell clanged faintly. Smoke from new chimneys trailed upward in calm braids. The town that might have died in whiteness now gleamed soft amber, full of motion and renewal. Weeks later, a travelling surveyor passed through and took an interest in the earthwork yards. He sketched them for a regional paper, calling them the Prairie Forts of Brookvale. By autumn, settlers in counties 50 miles away were building their own sod wind traps using crude copies of Elias's design. Letters arrived asking for measurements. Someone in Omaha even offered to pay for plans. Elias chuckled when he read that letter. "The world always wants blueprints," he said, folding it carefully. "But the truth's simpler. Pick up a shovel before you pick up a pen." The second winter arrived months later. Snow came again, fierce as memory, but no longer cruel. From the ridge above town, the drifts shaped themselves obediently against curved berms, never burying a door or sealing a vent. Each house carried its ring of calm air, smoke rising straight into the clear night sky. Inside his cabin, Elias warmed his hands near the stove, listening to the muffled stillness of safety. Outside, laughter echoed from neighbors clearing roofs easily in waist-high snow that stopped where they told it to. Brookvale had learned. Mara poured coffee and smiled. "You've made the wind behave." Elias shook his head slowly. "No one makes the wind behave," he said. "You just learn to listen early, before it starts shouting." He looked toward the window, where the moonlight traced a soft silver line along the sod wall, the first one he'd built, long before belief caught up. There, carved by cold and faith in equal measure, lay proof that the earth itself could be teacher, fortress, and friend. And somewhere beyond that glowing ridge, the wind sighed not in defiance, but in respect.